Hello, good morning. Hello, good morning. Excellent. So Leslie Koch, I think, set up this conversation in a pretty extraordinary way, and we have 6 incredible minds who are going to help us dive into some of the issues she raised and take on some of the questions that she suggested we answer. And as we're diving into that, I just want to join everyone in congratulating both the Stavros Niarchos Foundation and the country of Greece on what I think is a pretty remarkable achievement in this cultural center. And last night, I was lucky enough to hear Renzo Piano and Michael Kimmelman in conversation on the stage. And Michael Kimmelman was talking to Renzo about how he really returned to the people of Athens their kaliathea, right? The beautiful view, which is how this neighborhood is known. And that took on a very different resonance for me as I sort of took that extraordinary walk from the street up to the roof of the Opera House and looked out and saw people next to me in wheelchairs and with walkers and in various kinds of mobility. And I realized that he did something extraordinary, which was he took the beautiful view that was always this neighborhood's right, and he opened it up to even more people, right? He made that accessible to people of all abilities. And I think that notion of thinking through who is the user of a space, what do we assume about the people who are coming to it, is something that's hugely important to us. So, as we sort of dive in, there's a disclaimer that I want to make, which I think is pretty obvious to everyone by now, which is that I'm an American, right? And so that means 2 things. I think the most important thing is that sitting on stage with Debora and Ron holds special significance for me because there are at least 2 American presidents that I'm proud of. The second thing, which I think is equally important, is that my understanding and many of our understandings of public space, those of us who are living and working in America, is informed by our own complicated history with public space. And the fact that public spaces in America are contested properties, are contested places since at least 1492, since the first contact between the non-native people and the native peoples of America. And I think we haven't necessarily wrestled with all of that. And I think for at least the Americans of us on the panel, that's something that informs a lot of how we think and how we talk. So Leslie threw up a couple sort of definitions of public space. She asked us to think about sharing. She asked us to think about a lot. I tend to think of the architect David Adjaye. And David Adjaye is perhaps best known for the Smithsonian Museum of African American History that just opened in Washington, D.C. And he said that space only truly becomes public when people recognize it and utilize it as such. And so that notion of recognition and utilization is what I'd like to ask us to sort of carry into our conversation. And I'm going to begin at sort of stage left, your right, with Evangelia Athanassiou from Thessaloniki, from the University of Aristotle. And you are a historian. You think about public spaces. You think about urban design. You think about architecture. And many of us, Stelios and Leslie, have talked about the notion of the Athenian Agora. So can you sort of tell us from your frame, help us into your conversation of public space? How do you understand it? What do we need to think about? How do people recognize and utilize public space?
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. I'm really honored, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So I thought just to take some notes, not only on how public space is constituted, but also how its role in the city has been changing through its history. So public space is obviously an urban void, is a physical constituent of the urban fabric, but of course, it's much more than that. It refers to how people use it, to what meanings people invest on it, also what behaviors are allowed in it. So I would say that public space has never really been the publicly owned, tolerant, open to everybody space of solidarity and social exchange that is commonly imagined. And maybe it's provocative to say that even the Athenian Agora, which is the paradigmatic democratic space, the space that is so much related to the public sphere, and where democracy was actually practiced, even this was actually working under some assumptions. It was an institution in which not everybody was allowed. I mean, if you were a woman or a foreigner or a slave, you wouldn't take part in this. So I would say that much more than a physical constituent of the city, public space is an ongoing process, something that has always been fought for, that has always been redefined. And there are different ways in which nowadays it's being perceived and being managed and being designed. And there are some challenges. I don't know, maybe, should I continue posing what I think or what have prevailed as challenges in the academic discussion of the public nature of public space. For example, I would pose on the increasing role of the private sector into the management of public space. I'm not talking only about privately owned public spaces, like spaces within malls or gated communities, but I'm referring to softer mechanisms that, like sponsoring, programming, management, maintenance, or even redevelopment of public spaces that's being taken over by the corporate sector. I mean, this as such may not have a lot of implications, but sometimes it does. Sometimes the corporate identity is very strong in the physical space. Sometimes increased regulation is being imposed. Of course, sometimes, as Jakab Park has already been mentioned, it allows for more, let's say, freedom or tolerance than in even a publicly owned space. So I think this is one challenge that has to be discussed. And another thing is vindicated on safety, which is something that we all want in contemporary urban life. Sometimes regulation of public space is quite strong, and sometimes even exclusionary politics are performed. And of course, these are addressed to the weakest parts of the society, or most notably, I would say, you know, the homeless, substance users, the buskers. But I think sometimes this goes even beyond these more obvious groups that we would think. Sometimes even young people just having a drink in the open air are also not wanted. So although we want spaces full of people with different people, with social exchange and vitality, sometimes some people are undesirable, are not wanted, and there is often regulation, surveillance, cameras that sort of protect, make maybe public space safer, maybe more attractive, but not so tolerant or so open.
Right.
So, yeah.
That's great. Thank you for that. I want to come to Debora Spar next, who's the relatively recently appointed president of Lincoln Center. And rather than picking up on the sort of surveillance piece, that notion of spaces for everyone, right? We think about the Athenian Agora as a space for everyone, but we didn't mean women, we didn't mean foreigners, and we didn't mean slaves. You're now president of a place that welcomes, what, 5 million people a year for some very specific activities. And many of the institutions that make up Lincoln Center take as their model, take as their sort of metaphor, the cathedral, right? These are sacred spaces. These are actually apart from eating and drinking and smoking spaces. We want to come to see something sacred, something apart. Talk to me about sort of how do you navigate on a campus like Lincoln Center? How do you navigate with those institutions? What is private? What is public? How do you open up private experiences to the vast public?
Well, I think you've put your finger on a really important tension here. Because places like Lincoln Center, places like this center, you want them to have a certain awe-inspiring quality to them. You don't want them to feel like the neighborhood McDonald's. You want them to feel special and sacred. They are modern-day cathedrals. You know, it's interesting looking at some of the pictures Leslie had up earlier. You know, we see stairways in many of these special spaces. You see them here, you know, in the Parthenon, that you sort of want to walk up into a special space. So how then do you also make these special spaces feel inclusive? And you know, it's something we're struggling with at Lincoln Center, and I think we've solved partly, but haven't totally solved. In the recent renovation, which is before my time, so I can take no credit for it, but it was a beautiful renovation. They put hello on the stairs, which sounds a little bit trite, but it really works. The hello is in lights, and I think it's in 64 different languages. And so the first thing you see on this staircase is explicitly a welcoming message. The other thing we've done, which a lot of other places have done, and it works beautifully, is fountains. So there's a fountain that catches your eye right on top of the stairs, and it draws you in. And it's beautiful and it's magical. And even though the fountain is performing to some extent, because it jumps and it's choreographed and it's beautiful, but anyone can watch a fountain. Whereas I think if you're thinking about walking into the Met Opera, there is some barrier to entry, which is intellectual. I don't understand opera. I don't speak Italian, but anyone can watch a fountain. Anyone can walk up the stairs. So I think that the tension is, how do you maintain that specialness at the same time that you're physically designing things that will draw an audience in?
And Debora, when we were sort of standing outside getting ready, you mentioned some market research that you went through. So you've got hello on the stairs, you've got playful fountains. Is it working? Do people feel welcome at Lincoln Center?
We still have to do more. One of the things, as you and I were discussing, that the market research shows is that people oftentimes feel that Lincoln Center isn't for them. They're not smart enough, they're not rich enough, they're not musical enough. And you have to find a way to get over those barriers to entry. One of the things we're playing with now, which I just think would be beautiful if we could do it, is how do you use the sense of sound? So everything at Lincoln Center has music, or has an audio component. So can we actually project that music so that when you're walking by, whether it's in your ear or on your phone, you can actually hear the music? And you know, in a Pied Piper-like way, can we use the music to draw people in?
That's great. So I'd love to sort of pick up that notion of permeability and come to you, Ron. So seated to Debora's left is Ron Daniels, the president of Johns Hopkins University. And many of our cultural institutions don't have windows, right? Because we need to control the lighting, we need to control what's going on. So Debora's experimenting with using sound to make those permeable and to invite people and let them know what's going on inside. You're thinking of a different kind of permeability. You're thinking of Johns Hopkins as resident in the city of Baltimore. And you're thinking about sort of the traditional tension between town and gown of how do you connect the university and the town. So tell me how you're, as a university president, thinking about the city that you're inhabiting. How are you guys connecting with that city, with Baltimore?
So it's great to be back here and to have an opportunity to talk about some of the work that we've done in Baltimore. 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to talk at length about some of the city building efforts that we're involved in. Again, just in shorthand, Baltimore obviously is a city that has many strengths, but a significant set of challenges, and is riven by very serious racial segregation, a history of deindustrialization, and a city that at one time housed 1.1 million people is now about 600,000. And in that city, it happens that Johns Hopkins University and Health System is the largest private employer and largest private employer in the state as well. And so, to your point, you know, the question for us has been, how do we demonstrate that the university is not just in or at, but truly of the city? And how do we essentially understand our role as an anchor institution in a way that creates real connectivity with the city and actually serves as a site where some of the solitudes that have emerged in the city can get bridged either on our campuses or by virtue of some of the things that we're doing. And so one of the major projects that I inherited that I've been very involved with for the last 8 years is an 88-acre project, which is one of the largest urban renewal projects in the United States. It's just the north of our health campus. And these blocks are no doubt among the most challenged, not just in Baltimore, but of any city in America. So 70, 80% vacancy rates on any social indicia. The people who are there, if you look at life expectancy, health levels, education levels, violence levels, this is an extremely challenged community. And so it's in that setting that we've been charged with playing a role with the Annie Casey Foundation and 2 levels of government with trying to create a new sense of place. And there, for me, one of the most important things was to figure first and foremost, how could we do things through this 88-acre block knowing that it was going to be totally rejuvenated, and the vision was of a mixed income, mixed use project. How could we actually do things that created this sense of connectivity and permeability? And in particular, started to do something that had not been done very frequently in Baltimore, which was to get the university community moving out of its bubble into the community, and likewise creating signals that the community was welcome onto the health campus. And so we did that once at the start with real intentionality around which were the first projects that we would work on, focusing on building a public school that was for the community but would be operated by the university for the benefit of the community. We did it by creating a magnificent 5.5-acre park that is a green space that, again, was meant to be a site for bringing together folks from within the university community, but folks from the community, and again, creating a sense that this would be a meeting place where the worlds could start to collide and intersect in a way that they hadn't before. And on top of those things, about thinking which were the first physical projects, what we thought a lot about was how do we give agency to the people within the community so that when they entered into these public spaces, they did so with more capability, with more confidence than they might otherwise would have been able to. And there we focused on jobs, on trying to find ways in which we could give opportunities to people from within the community that they could be vital in those public spaces. And just the last point, and again, I think it's important that as much as we talk about placemaking as about doing things in terms of the physical character of these projects, what was really important was to give control, agency, governance to the community so that they, in fact, were in control of the park. They have a budget for doing programming. They're thinking about what are the competing uses and how they'll be mediated, but it's not the university doing it to the park, it is the community. And again, seeing these kinds of opportunities of ways of bringing city and university together.
It's amazing. Jakab, let me come to you. To my left is Jakab Orsos, who's the Vice President of Arts and Culture for the Brooklyn Public Library. And you bring to your work a background working at festivals. And festivals are primarily not known for their spaces, right? They're known for their programming. And traditionally, we think of libraries as spaces, right? As physical spaces. And ironically, the number of in-person visits to libraries is up, at least in America. And people want to come together and be together in space. What have you found going from sort of the festival frame to the library building frame? How is that working? Why do people want to come together? And what are libraries getting right?
Well, they just want to, I think in the changing political landscape and the changing world, not just politically, in a increasingly lonely public spaces, meaning cities, what we really looking for, all of us, is the sense of belonging. Almost like in a metaphoric sense, we all come together to entertain the illusion of love, what we keep losing on a larger scale. And what a library can do is graciously and embracing the kitschiness and the romantic notion of it, providing this love, providing emotions. So yes, we do have spaces. We do have, actually in Brooklyn, we have 60 libraries, 60 physical buildings. But it's really important to me, and that was the biggest kind of learning curve, changing from the festival world to a more established institution, is to really focus on what we are talking about in these buildings. So what we dare to talk about. And that's, to me, is one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest inspiration. So people are coming to enjoy this real or false sense of belonging, but also they come if we talk to them. You really have to mean what you say in public spaces, and that's hugely important. And you can't fake it. Again, just in love, you can't fake it. So sooner or later, they'll know. She'll know, he'll know. And our audience will know. So you can fake it for a couple of months, years, but you have to open up, and that's really interesting, and that's what brings us to the art field. I always consider our works as a newly forming and ever shaping work of art. You have to address the profoundest questions: who you are and what you recognize important, and how you appreciate the other and how you understand the other. This is all sound really grandiose, but when it boils down to everyday our works, it's really about to understand our audience and the other. And yes, the homeless, the drinker, the not so pleasant other too. And that's interesting, and it's hugely important that you do understand that too, that person too. In a frighteningly elegant setup. But that's it will come, and how you address it, that's the real task.
I think it's really interesting that sort of you talked about loneliness, and Ron, you talked about solitude, and sort of addressing loneliness and solitude and that notion of gathering. I want to turn to Maria Hlavajova from Bach, the artistic director of Bach in Utrecht in the Netherlands. And it was interesting to me that as I was reading about Bach, you talk about yourself as a platform for art. You don't talk about yourself as a space for art. And in the United States, in Washington, D.C., a friend of mine, a poet and small business owner called Andy Shalal, ran for mayor of Washington, D.C., and he didn't win, but he learned a lot on the campaign. And one of the things he said he learned was that in Washington, D.C., white folks live in neighborhoods and black folks live in communities. And I think there's a profound difference between the sort of built environment first approach and the people first approach. And in your very intentional use of the word platform for Bach, that's something that people use. That's something that it suggests people coming together and creating. Talk to us about why you're a platform and not a space.
Thank you, Jamie, for this question. I think it's very important. Bach is a very tiny place when we talk about places and spaces. It's essentially a research center that wants to debate from within a triangle, or from within the relations between art, science, and politics, the question how to live together otherwise. And when with a group of friends and colleagues we were founding this place 17 years ago, it was precisely this struggle around the question, what is public space? And never being really quite capable to articulate precisely what it is, because there is no such thing as public space. It's always a kind of constellation, composition of public, private, economic, social, political, etc. And then we thought at that very moment that we would like to ask a question of ourselves: what would an art institution look like if it's not identified as a building, if it's disassociated with an idea of architecture? And that already provides you with very many very interesting shifts. So if an art institution is not a building, ever more beautiful, ever more spectacular, we think buildings, and very often buildings allow us to gather, but they always limit us as well in setting for us some sort of protocols, how to maintain them, how to make them functioning, etc., etc., etc. So what happens? Actually, you end up with an institution that is nomadic, that's mobile, and can actually relocate as a body of thinking, discourse, perhaps ideology, anywhere where it's needed. So this shift from space towards community, indeed, this replacement of the notion of public space that we tend to be very poetic about, and I'm very grateful for your comments, it's essentially a violent space without protection. And I perhaps exaggerate slightly, but I think we need to take this into account where we debate it. So you essentially make a shift from a space to a notion of assembly, perhaps. From where to gather, who gathers, for what reasons, why, and how. And I said that we at BAC try to address all that remarkable knowledge that's accumulated through artistic practice, through sciences, and in the field of politics, to try to answer this very simple question that is one of the most difficult ones at the same time. How do we live together otherwise? And it's not just to critique the world we are in. It's not just to address the ills, the crises we experience, but try to see whether we can really envision positive propositions, how to live otherwise, and whether in that collective we actually can inhabit it. And you will then understand that it's not a gallery you need, it's not a white cube, it's not necessarily a room like this. It's essentially a possibility to be together, not even in physical sense. It can be even imagined performance of being together and trying to articulate through and with art the possibilities for that. And this has turned to be extraordinarily exciting experiment. At this very moment, we seeing the rise of seeing Europe and other parts of the world repeating old bad habits of nationalism, fascism. Our question at this moment is how to live non-fascist lives. Not to map out fascisms, not to talk about anti-fascism, but what a life without abuse of power would look like. And can we look each other in the eyes or in your own image in the mirror in the morning and say, well, I don't abuse power. I'm not enamored of power. And this is extraordinarily difficult, and I believe extraordinarily important in the times like ours.
That's great. Maria, thank you for that. And I want to remind everyone who's watching that if you go to that snf.org/conference, you can send in questions, you can send in comments, and I love that provocation that there is no such thing as a public space. So would love to hear what some folks out there are thinking about that. So Bryan, let me come to you. Bryan Doerries is the artistic director, founder of Theater of War, and we're going to get to see some of your work tomorrow, I think, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So Maria doesn't want to start with the building, right? Yeah. And most artistic organizations at least start with the art, right? I've got some opera and I want to think about who wants to see it, where do I want to do it? When I think about your work, I tend to think about audience first.
That's right.
And I think in many ways, you're one of the few artistic folks I know who begin with the audience and then sort of back into everything else. So how do you start with the concept of the audience you're trying to reach and end up in what space you need to be?
Sure. So over the last 10 years, we've presented more than 650 performances in spaces like military bases, prisons, hospitals, hospice clinics, addiction clinics, places like Fukushima, places like Michael Brown's High School in Ferguson, Missouri. But it hasn't been a desire to be in those spaces that's led us there. We start with a different question. We start with the question, for whom? For whom? And the question maybe underneath that question is, whose stories are these? Who has the proprietary right to be talking about them? And so we start from that, and then the second question we ask is, what do they need? And once we answer that question, then we start to get to questions like selection of the text we're going to perform, the type of actors we're going to bring in, the type of community members we're going to activate, the organizations we're going to work with to very specifically and purposefully curate an audience that has skin in the game, for whom the words that are being spoken, the thing that's being performed is not simply entertainment, but is actually a catalyst for boundary dissolution. And I think about, how we've performed in all those spaces. We've also performed at the Guggenheim Museum and the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and we're going to be performing here tomorrow morning. And all of the different obstacles and challenges of working in a homeless shelter or an opera house are predicated on the expectations that are laid upon audiences for how they are to behave in those spaces. And for us, sometimes it's much easier to achieve our objective by performing in a place where culture doesn't really exist, or where there's no formalized sense of culture, because people have not been acculturated to behave in a standardized manner, and then that opens up new possibilities. So the great stage director Peter Brook, who's been a hero of mine and a mentor and a friend, when we started a discourse about my work, he observed, in the 60s, the primary question, the primary concern of our work in the theater was space. And of course, he wrote the famous book, The Empty Space. Now, the primary question of the 21st century is audience. And I think that's, that's a challenge, that's a provocation. I guess, if we think about space, and I don't want to think of it in such binary terms, but as you were suggesting in your email to us as kind of the hardware, and as culture, or what happens in that space, as the software. For my work, or for our work, we know that the software is working when after the performance we hold discussions, and the discussions last longer than the performances, and they're not ancillary to the performance, they are the performance. We know the project is working when the lowest ranking person in the room, the person who feels he or she has no proprietary right to be speaking about culture, is the one who's speaking. And the way we get to that place, and by the way, we perform ancient Greek tragedies primarily, with a belief that ancient Greek tragedy was an ancient technology, maybe more pertinent to this conversation than the Agora, designed to dissolve boundaries. The god Dionysus is the god of boundary dissolution, of ecstasy. How do we acknowledge that we're all playing roles and that we work within rigid hierarchies? It turns out all these institutions in which we're working and performing illustrate over and over again that Foucault was right. There really is no difference between a prison and a cultural institution, and a university and a hospital and a homeless shelter and a foundation. They all operate in sort of rigid hierarchies with surveillance and discipline and punishment. And once you enter them, those institutions, you are subject to all of those unwritten rules, that sort of hidden series of power structures. So we know it's working in our performances when we've invited everyone from the community. Recently we did a performance in Jakab's library, Linda Johnson's library, the Brooklyn Public Library in New York City, their Grand Army Plaza flagship, beautiful Art Deco sort of temple to learning. And in the center of this beautiful space, we did a performance of Euripides' Madness of Heracles. We made sure that we had enough people in the audience who'd experienced gun violence firsthand, that when it came time to speak, sure, there might be a few academics or curators who might feel a proprietary right to stand up at first and sort of, tell us what to think, but then a 15-year-old gang member could stand up and say, I understand what this play is about because I've lived it. This is my experience. So that's what we're looking for. And unfortunately, we have to work against all of the tensions, all of the behaviors that we're acculturated to, to sort of absorb, to come into spaces like this and like Lincoln Center and like universities in order to get to the place where we actually are having a democratic conversation. We're having democratic discourse.
Ron, jump in.
So You know, I'm sure you're not saying, though, that when we talk about the need to expand audience and to create these opportunities for parts of our community who typically aren't part of these conversations to get there, that we want to totally upend rules. That is to say, you know, and this is perhaps the legal academic that's coming out. I would say there are, for a number of these spaces, and again, I think it's been captured in the discussion we're having around here, we have to have some set of rules, some set of norms that will guide how people will interact in these so-called public spaces, however we define these public spaces. So for instance, you know, I'm thinking about within the university community, and Debora and I were just talking about this a few moments ago, as heads of universities, we've gone through in the United States, but indeed not only in the United States, these very traumatic moments over the last couple of years where really free speech is being tested. And the sense is that people want to have a forum on campus to bring in what are outlier views, and then there's a strong counter reaction. And you know, as a university leader, I feel very strongly that these are moments when we have to have clear ground rules which actually specify the entitlement for that kind of speech and the protection of it, knowing that that's going to be controversial. But nevertheless, we have to have some rules governing how people interact in this space, particularly if we want to imagine that these are spaces that are regularly inhabited by different speakers, providing different challenges to our sense of truth and received wisdom. I'm thinking about this park that I talked about a few moments ago in East Baltimore, which we've created with a real view to trying for it to be an ingathering of a number of different communities that typically don't interact together. But we know, to the point that was made earlier, that homeless folks are going to turn up. You know, there's going to be no doubt a number of different challenges from a very gritty urban community. We're going to see actors coming into this space. And again, I think our challenge is how do we get them there, but again, create norms of behavior where we can see the kind of the benefits of this diversity, but without imagining that it becomes so offensive that people ultimately are fearful of being there.
So, Jakab, I want to come to you, but I don't want to let President Daniels off the hook. So we need rules for different groups of people coming together in public space. Who gets to set the rules? Because homeless communities have rules of how folks interact. The disconnected communities that you're talking about around the park do, and the university does. So who sets the rules? Who gets to decide what is the correct norm for behavior in public space?
So I think, again, it depends, you know, it depends on the institutions you're talking about.
So let's talk about the park.
Well,
let's talk very specifically about the park in Baltimore.
So I think
who sets norms for behavior in the park?
There's a community group that has broad stakeholder representation, and they're the ones who are going to mediate these disputes. It's not going to be the university. It's not going to be the city elders. It's going to be, you know, a broad multi-constituency group that will have to work this through together. And I think that's right. And it's not just that they set rules, but they'll also have budget to figure out the kinds of cultural moments, the kinds of activities that they want to have in that space. And again, with a view to having the agency to really control this space for themselves.
That's awesome. Jakab, please.
Yeah, I think it's a hugely important question. Who set the rules and who has the right to set the rules? Working in an institution, it's a change in my life too. Working at a big, humongous institution, the Brooklyn Public Library, who was brave enough, Linda Johnson is the president here at the library, was brave enough to hire me, and I was ignorant enough to take this job, not knowing what it comes with. And what I think and what I learned over the course of the last year, that the entity what sets the rules are the people. And it sounds ridiculously corny, but it is true. And those are the rules what are ever changing. So if you listen and if you bestow this power to your audience, to the demos, to your crowd, then they're gonna set their rules and they keep those rules. And it's a risky, really risky step, because you have to lean back and you have to trust that it's going to work, and it works. One of my second biggest projects after presenting Bryan at the library, we presented an overnight night of philosophy with the French Cultural Services in the library. And again, Linda and the team of the library was, again, trusting me, trusting our audience to keep the library 12 hours open from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., presenting 65 lectures on philosophy with music, bars, everything, an open building, open shelves, open bookshelves. It's a lending library. So you can imagine how I was freaking out before opening the library at 7 p.m. for 7,000 people. No books were stolen, not that we know of, but not a lot of books were stolen. and then 7 a.m. we closed the library, and our pretty tough security team came up to me, congratulating me, and I told them that, listen, this shouldn't come to me, this should come to the 7,000 people. They actually listened to us, and they set those rules, and they obeyed to these rules.
So I want to come to Debora, but 7,000 people showed up for an overnight party about French philosophy?
No.
All kinds of philosophy.
All kinds of philosophy.
All kinds of philosophy. All kinds of philosophy.
From slowness in sex to the notion of tragedy.
I think that's amazing. Debora, please.
Yes, so maybe it's the sort of the university presidents who have sort of found themselves being quasi-authoritarian here. But I want to jump in because I do want to agree with Ron from experience, not in my Lincoln Center role, but in my college president role. Because I think at this moment in time in the United States, and I'm pretty sure it's true in Europe as well, we're experiencing a moment where the possibility of violence is becoming real in places that we couldn't have imagined it even a few years ago. And I think it's wonderful, and it's what we want to move towards, to have this sense that groups of people can come together and mediate their own interaction. But it's not always true. And I'm particularly pessimistic, sadly, when I look at the younger generation for whom their social interaction has been mediated by technology for their whole lives. And so they actually have a very tough time figuring out how to disagree in real life when they can no longer just swipe left or right. And you can pick any college campus in the United States. In the past 2 years, we've had moments of real stress. And they frequently can come down to debates for which it's very hard to make clear rules, and they have to do with free speech. And we had one on my campus, but I'm sure we've all had them. What do you do when one group wants to engage in speech that is seen by others as hateful? Whether it's homophobic, sexist, racist, they're all happening. And I don't know that there's a magic set of rules that any one of us have come up with, but I think those of us who run these spaces, and maybe universities are particularly prone, we do find ourselves in the awkward positions of having to set rules. Otherwise, you're going to have people actually harming each other.
Right. Evangelia, can I ask you to jump in for a second? And what are some of that notion that language and ideas can become dangerous and violent in very real and physical ways, and the ways that those still play out in spaces? When you think sort of as an architect, when you think as an urban designer, is it possible to design a physical space for dangerous ideas?
For what?
For dangerous ideas?
Yes, I think yes. Well, I think space matters. Of course, other things also are very important, as I said, softer mechanisms and regulations and stuff. But I think the way you design space, how open you design it, how accessible you design it, how equipped it is for people, maybe with, I don't know, urban furniture and fountains and everything. And also you can design spaces that are exclusive. You can design homeless-proof equipment. You can have closing times. So all this is true. For example, I would say that I want to pose an example here about how public space is used by the young people nowadays in Greece, and there has been a conflict recently on that, because of the crisis and for mostly financial reasons, young people tend to use public space more, and they prefer to have a drink out rather than sitting in a bar or a cafe. And of course, this has happened in central spaces and has created a lot of conflict with shop owners and cafe owners who actually see this as actually putting more or even more pressure to their already shrunk, revenues. And also residents have started to protest and calling for the police all the time. So there are spaces nowadays in Thessaloniki, for example, where I live, which are more obviously contested than ever, or than the last decade, for example. So I think this is how, not only an urban designer has to respond, but the whole community has to respond and actually understand that the public space is always a contested space, and not just say that, okay, there's going to be consensus, and somehow think how we can design for spaces that are contested and can accommodate different desires, different interests, different views on public space. And I'm not talking about, I think a university campus is different. I mean, there are different kinds of public spaces. A public square in the center of a city and a park in a neighborhood are different spaces. No, and the final thing I would say is that we should also turn our attention to these small spaces that are off-center, that people actually spend their everyday lives, because I think everyday lives is a terrain in which a lot can be done, not only in formal policies, not only in big ideas, but also the way we actually live our everyday lives and how we use public space which is just in front of our houses, and how tolerant we are. Because you know that there is an outbreak in grassroots initiatives, and we actually think that this is, and it is a positive trend, particularly for the use of public space. But this can have different political dimensions too. I mean, some grassroots initiatives may be, open, porous, create open activities and everything, and some grassroots initiatives can be very closed, very create enclosures rather than opening public space, like neighborhood watch initiatives, citizen patrols, and this kind of stuff are also grassroots, but do not create open spaces, create closer, more enclosed spaces.
Maria, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, just perhaps Evangelia said quite touch up on issues I wanted to bring up. But for me, from this conversation, I would like to point out two things. One is, again, the issue of process. To gather people with opposing ideas in a space for the sake of that performance is extraordinarily dangerous. And the scale. Quite consciously, Bach stayed very tiny institution that can work almost one-on-one. I understand this is not a blueprint for how a university campus can work. But in preparation for debates that need to take place, I mean, they must take place. And the art institutions have been, called as a places where you preach to your own...
choir.
Yes, choir.
Yes. We're
I
going to
wanted
bring
to
one
say
out
preach to your own parochy, which I realize it's Dutch suddenly, but I couldn't remember. So these places have to open up. Yeah. We need those negotiations. We need to face those negotiations. And then we heard in the keynote about shared space. Maybe we can see art institutions perhaps even as safe spaces where you can bring up, and this is what we've been doing. I mean, come on, non-fascist lives, this is quite serious if you want to bring various groups with various ideological convictions together. set it up as a performance, set it up as a rehearsal, reading up the script, do it up until the moment when that kind of imagination of an artwork becomes a possibility in reality. Do it small scale, do it in a process, so that we indeed unlearn to live in our bubble and learn, look up, and see how we can do this otherwise. And art is crucial in this. I don't know any other space where these kind of things are really possible, given the crisis we face today.
Well, and one of the things that sort of bubbled up from a number of you was sort of the word surveillance. And we've also heard the word safety. And we know that art and culture is often home to the most dangerous ideas, and the only people who seem to get that are authoritarian dictators and fascists, right? Because they lock up the writers, they shut down the theaters, they execute the artists. So in this world where we're concerned with safety, where violence is tiptoeing into the bubbles that many of us on stage have been lucky enough to inhabit because we haven't had a violence as a part of our everyday lives, although that's not been true for everyone, when we need dangerous ideas, when we need more exposure to the other, how do you think about safety in your work? Bryan, let me maybe start with you, because you're dealing, I mean, I was at the performance in the Brooklyn Library, and at this performance was a police officer. At this performance was someone who had experienced gun violence. At this performance was someone who had perpetrated gun violence. There are very real live stakes at play. How do you approach that? How do you think about that? What's your obligation in terms of setting that up?
Yeah. Well, I can say in the United States, when we say the word town hall discussion, what we mean is a group of people shouting at each other, defaming each other, and savaging each other in a public space. That's what political discourse is now. It's become petty and puerile. We use the most, inelegant and basest tactics to sort of hurt each other. So one of the principles of our work, which is based on Greek tragedy, is if you want to have a conversation about a topic that divides us, a topic that's explosive, a topic that could cause us to descend into violence or into that kind of agonistic and hateful relationship, start with a portrayal of human suffering first, and then have the conversation. And by virtue of an actor delivering an incredibly compelling representation of suffering that borders on something that you cannot actually discern between what is real and what isn't, we are reminded as human beings of the fragility of our own existence, of the roles that we are playing, of the basic humanity we all share, and then we can enter into discourse. And that's where theater and art and different forms of art are strategies for getting people to engage. But also, I just want to say, and I know it's not, I don't mean in any way to be flippant about large institutions and the risks they have to take. I mean, judging just from the security we had to pass through to get into this space, there must be a large threat to even this space here, because we had to pass through a massive security apparatus just to be sitting here. So I don't mean to belittle or in any way, but I also feel like now is the time where we as artists and architects and scholars and curators have, because the stakes are life and death for most people who are living in our world, the stakes of what we do have to be of that magnitude. So I'm just reminded briefly, we premiered the project Antigone and Ferguson, which we'll be performing tomorrow morning in Michael Brown's high school in Ferguson, Missouri, just after the 2-year anniversary of Michael Brown's death, an unarmed African-American youth who was killed by a white police officer in the United States, and triggered massive unrest, not just in the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, but all over the country. We go in with Antigone to perform, and we'll talk about it and show you more tomorrow, but the same week where we premiered this project, one of the self-appointed leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement in Ferguson had been found dead in the trunk of a car. An individual who had been threatened by the police openly. And neo-Black Panthers were walking the streets of Ferguson with weapons exposed. Those are the stakes in which we come into in American communities, do a play about essentially what we're trying to frame a discussion about is police-community relations and what happens when personal conviction clashes with the law of the state. And if we weren't willing to take the risk of being shot or hurt, or having my small theater company or institution totally destroyed in the process, then we wouldn't achieve our goal. And for the people that we're performing and bringing together, the stakes are higher than for us. We have an insurance policy. I'm sure Lincoln Center does too. But they don't. And I think it's beholden upon us as practitioners to take the risk of violence. And finally, I just want to say, I think one of the principal problems of our institutions is the inherent didacticism of our relationship with audience. So we act as artists as if it's our gift to bestow upon the audience, the gift of culture. But what if we actually cultivated a true humility for the experiential intelligence in every community, in every room, and opened ourselves to the possibility that the gift is actually coming from the people who've gathered, and to be bestowed upon us, the artists, upon us, the architects, upon us.
Amazing. Maria, I want your voice, and I want everyone else to begin thinking about refugees. I want us to talk for a minute about people who are seeking out safe spaces and leaving dangerous spaces. But Maria, join us first.
I just wanted to tie into this question of safety, security, because it's important for our discussion about public spaces. In our case, majority of the trajectory within the process of this negotiation is going to happen behind the closed doors. It's going to be small scale, and this has enormous consequences because as an art institution, you have certain obligations. The bigger the audience, the better, right? So we have to rethink art institutions who engage in these kind of practices away from economic quantitative models into ecological qualitative models. And this has consequences. And we're in discussion with our funders. What do you do in a situation you need to spend enormous amount of money for this process where in each of these gatherings only 5 people gather, because then it remains safe? You cannot advertise these events as public events, but you still can allow public access, but ex post. So, for example, this changes the life of publicity or marketing or whatever you call it of an art institution. You don't advertise events ahead of time, but you invest into recording, archiving, and making it public otherwise, so that it still remains a crucial, critical learning document for a variety of communities to adopt, to learn how to negotiate around the question how to live otherwise. But this is changing our understanding of a Western institution that we established until the ages of Western modernity upside down. I think we need to recognize that in order to do this kind of work well, in order to recognize art as a space for politics otherwise, we need to rethink and institute the institutions otherwise.
That's exactly right. Jakab, please.
I was just thinking that, I was thinking since Debora was mentioning surveillance, and I was just imagining myself in her position running Lincoln Center, with all these concerns, which I can easily, semi-easily shrug off working for a public institution. But I do understand your concern, and I do understand the concern in general. But I was thinking that this is part of our lives, part of our reality. What about embracing it? What about elevating it onto a almost like at least visible, almost artistic level? What about building surveillance, building part of our reality, part of our lives as part of the process? You come into our institution, you come into Lincoln Center, you have to go through surveillance. That's when your experience with art starts. So it's part of darkness is part of our lives. I always think about my job in the library as we call it safe havens. We always glamorize it. It's one of the darkest places. It's the place, and I think most of us share this, places where we raise and face with the most brutal, most darkest questions. So how about embracing it? How about internalizing it? Yes, we have surveillance. We have a chance to be killed. Or we have a chance that someone just walks in and explodes himself or herself. So build this in. So when you come to an opera house, you may as well take a risk. So that's just a suggestion. I don't know how to do it, but but that could be interesting.
Let me, if I
Yeah,
can,
Debora.
pick up on the word, really interesting word you raised of refugee and refuge. You know, and it's interesting at this moment to play with sort of both pronunciations of that word, because clearly this part of the world is dealing with massive refugee issues that create opportunities for art, create the need for art, create new channels through which art can mediate conversations that can't occur otherwise. At the same time, I wouldn't want us to lose sight of the fact that art itself can also just be a refuge. That yes, I may want to go to some artistic productions when I'm being challenged and I'm feeling scared, and that's part of the experience. But I might also just want to escape every once in a while. And I think we don't want to lose sight of that, that there is a joy and a beauty that comes from visual arts, performing arts. And I think we want to maintain that role of art, because part of art is to challenge us and engage us, but part of it is to escape. And I think those of us who run these organizations, we have that responsibility as well, to give people this refuge so that you can escape from whatever trials and tribulations are on in your own life and experience that sheer joy and that beauty that comes from art. So how do we maintain that balance between art as something scary and art as something of pure beauty?
So I love that, and I'm actually going to use that refuge word, that other pronunciation, as our sort of exit question. And we've been talking a lot about public spaces that are made for people to do something, to come together and do something. But are there public spaces for us to come together and do nothing? Are there what, we had a Secretary of Agriculture in the United States who talked about the need for campfire moments, where we just come together to be. And I had asked each of you to think about a sort of favorite public space, and the slight twist that I'd like to ask as we leave is, do you have a favorite public space in which you go to do nothing? Not a private space to do nothing, but a public space to do nothing and just be. That sort of notion of the human being. Where can you go to just be a human publicly? Let me just start at the end, we'll come right across, and then we'll thank you all for your time and wisdom.
I think this is very important that you're saying, and actually I was trying to say that earlier, but I forgot it. That what is important about public space is also to be a loose space sometimes. I mean, to give the opportunity to people to invent how they're going to use it, to somehow act spontaneously. I mean, and I'm saying this because there is a tendency in urban design at the moment for highly designed spaces with strong architectural identity, which we all enjoy and everything, but somehow these sort of have particular spaces for particular terrains, for particular uses, and I think they need to allow for more improvised, spontaneous acts where people will just think and invent and use it the way they want. Well, I thought of my favorite place. I'm not going to surprise you, because I'm going to say that my favorite space, and I think a space that actually does this, is the newly refashioned waterfront of Thessaloniki, which is designed by local architects and has become a terrain that is used by the whole of the city. Just for, walks and cycling and just doing not much. But also, the other positive thing that has happened, it has actually triggered the creation of many citizens groups that actually take care of the place or organize events in the place or collaborate with the municipality to organize events. And I think this has actually made that a very open and a very used space, which is a very good thing for the whole of the city.
That's great. An invitation to come do nothing in Thessaloniki. Yes. Thank you for that. Maria, a favorite public space in which you don't do much of anything?
I wanted to tie into the question of joy, because I think there is enormous joy in art of assemblism. It's a term established by an artist, Jonas Dahl, of coming together with people who struggle with same or similar problems. And I do think that's one of the tasks of art today, amongst many other tasks. And tying into it, I think the most important, the most joyful place I go to is a cooperative set up in Amsterdam between undeportable refugees and artists, because they recognize they have a lot in common, and that's the condition of precarity. And they together established a cooperative where they live together, work together, share together, etc., etc., etc. But most importantly, established an academy, educational institute, a campus, if you will, where refugees can receive education from artists, academics, according to their needs, and where the majority society gets extremely important education in survival.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Ron?
So, you know, I think the quick answer for me would be the great urban parks. You know, think about Central Park in New York, think about in Baltimore, Druid Hill Park, you know, think about places in Toronto, London, elsewhere, just where you get refuge from the pressures, the frenetic pace, the expectations of the city. So I think that's a quick move. I would say the other place that I love to be at, and particularly it's quite improbable in Baltimore, but it's the pop-up farmers markets. And for me in Baltimore, there's a weekly market that actually brings all of Baltimore. It's one of these places where a remarkable diversity of different communities comes together, but it's under a freeway. It's several blocks, it's under a major freeway. But that's a moment of real gathering where, yes, there's sort of spontaneous, there's buskers and so on. There's some art, but there's a lot of truck barter and trade of people hawking their wares. But it's just joyous and low expectation. And I think that's a nice place to be a fellow citizen and to meet constituencies, meet groups you might not otherwise.
Thank you. And I should say that no one was allowed to pick their own space as their favorite, and Hopkins University is an absolutely gorgeous place to do and to do nothing. So thank you for that. Debora.
Well, I think we're hearing more and more of a theme as we go down the line here, that there's something about these spaces that encourage spontaneity and the mixing together of people who otherwise wouldn't mix together. So I have a bunch in the States, but I was trying to think of one in Greece. It was actually pretty easy. So my husband was born here in Corfu, and there's a spectacular place in Corfu called Spianada, which is sort of the square, the esplanade. And it's existed through several regimes of folks who have governed Corfu, but it's the spot where everyone in the town comes out. I presume once because it was, you know, the cool place, I mean, cool temperature-wise. You know, it's by the ocean, it's grassy, but it's where people fall in love. It's where people sit for hours drinking coffee. It's where little kids go and ride their bicycles. And even though I'm obviously a foreigner when I go there, you never feel a foreigner. You just feel that it's these random groups of people all coming out to do nothing in particular, but coming together. And it's a wonderful space.
That's awesome. Excellent. Bryan.
Well, it's not always pleasant, but I really like the anonymity and also the profound confrontation with humanity on New York's public transportation. And I think about the subway, which in the summer can be a refuge from the heat. And with the delays we're now experiencing in New York, it can also be a sort of torture chamber. But what's lovely about the subway is you don't have to do anything, and every car is supplied with entertainment. There's usually someone who dissolves the boundaries of the subway within a few seconds with a speech or a request for money, but also that there's a togetherness that happens in that space that happens, I don't think, no other space in New York. And so it's a shame when people graduate from using public transportation, because you can be both alone and completely without obligation, but also be together with people in a way that rarely ever happens.
That's awesome. Jakab.
We actually, out of the same necessity, being away from the city, the noise, and also not having any expectations, we actually created our favorite spaces with Prospect Park. We do a campfire. Every month we have people gather and listen to a singer and talk about a subject like homelessness or public space. And it became my new favorite space. It's amazing to see people just getting lost in the experience of a small community and and low expectations, and the void of a fire. You gaze into fire, and there are people actually who cannot go home. They're just being mesmerized by the fire, and they just stay there, and you see how their mind emptying out, and that vision is actually it became one of my newest favorite spaces in the city.
I love that. So a tour that includes Greece, that includes Amsterdam, that includes a highway overpass in Baltimore, that includes public transportation, and that includes a campfire in a great American park. Please join me in thanking all of these panelists, Evangelia, Maria, Ron, Debora, Bryan, and Jakab. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.